This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Heshi from Borough Park, Lahaglil Torah Lahadira. I want to mention, first of all, thank Rav Heshi for sponsoring again, one of the earlier sponsors of the podcast. He sponsored a number of a few episodes of every summer, I think. So I want to thank him for that. As well as want to mention, if anyone else wants to sponsor an episode, it's $360. You can Zelle, Chase QuickPay, svarimchat@gmail.com, or there's a link in the show's notes via PayPal, as well as any amount. I very much appreciate listeners have sent $18, $25, $36, whatever, 50, 70 to 100, whatever the number is, any amount is very much appreciated. And so I just wanted to make mention of that. I'm looking into hopefully upgrading and updating some of the software experiences, so for like sound quality, better microphone, etc., things like that. You won't hear it for a while because a lot of the episodes have been recorded, so they are what they are. But going forward, new recordings. So not anything, but a lot of what if you would send would go towards that. So whatever it is, anyways, I appreciate any amount, whether it's full sponsorship or any amount that you are willing to give. Also, I would like to thank those who have subscribed and rated and reviewed, whether that rating and reviewing mainly on Apple, but subscribing on Spotify, also 24/6. Want to give them a plug now that we're after the 3 weeks. By the way, I spoke about them a couple weeks ago. It's just in general an excellent kind of the Jewish Spotify, so to speak, only Jewish music. 24/6. You can check them out. I'll put a link in the show's notes. You should check it out if you were not familiar with it, or if you don't have it. It's really an excellent service. Additionally, if anyone has any comments and feedback, hopefully I'm trying to get to emails quicker. And also, if you have any guest suggestions, I am taking suggestions going forward now, looking to record different things. So middle of the Spain series, so I'm not really recording more in the series. Could be if I have a really good guest suggestion, something's missing out. But the following series is mostly recorded, and I'm recording the one that's going to come after Spain, which is I would say it's the 10 Lost Tribes in Jewish consciousness. I think I've mentioned it before on the podcast, but if I haven't, well, there it is. That's mostly been recorded, and then I have a number of other ideas for series after that. Maybe things a little smaller. We'll see. So, but it should just be a random episode based on a sefer, a book, a historical topic, whatever it is. Email me, svarimchatter@gmail.com or nachi@svarimchatter.com, whatever, and let me know on that. And enjoy this week's episode about letters of Nechama from Gedolei Yisroel on lost, and it's in Hebrew and English, and very, very interesting stuff. Check out the links in the show's notes for the Hebrew and the English edition. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by R Doniel Hexter, who is a Skamanal in Yeshiva Gedolei Yisroel in Baltimore. And we'll be discussing his sefer that he compiled, and now is an English one, and there was a Hebrew one a few years ago, which is titled Vayinachim David, Igeres Tanchumen Megdolei Yisroel, or in English, Voices of Consolation, letters from Gedolei Yisroel to soothe the soul and restore the spirit of those who have experienced loss. And it was published by Israel Bookshop, and also with Alizayas. So thank you, Rabbi Hexter, for joining me.
Thank you. Glad to be on.
Okay, let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
I grew up in Los Angeles, went to Tarsemis, went to Yeshiva Gedolei for high school, then came to Baltimore, went to Ner Yisroel for Beis Medrash, went to Mir Yerushalayim for a year, came back to Ner Yisroel, got married, learned in Kail for 9 years, and then I became a Rebbe in Yeshivas Gedolei Yisroel in Baltimore, 4th grade Rebbe. So Rebbe for 16 years, and this past year I became a Skamanal for grades first and second grade in Yeshivas Gedolei Yisroel in TI, our institute in Baltimore, and that's where I am today.
Okay, so as I mentioned, this project is it's, as we mentioned, you compiled various letters from Gedolim, from different Gedolim. We'll talk about who they are and what they are, about Nechama, about the consolation for the loss of a spouse, a parent, a child, and just general letters of consolation. How did you get involved in this project? Now, really, I would say that the sefer is called Vayinachim David, so I guess that's
So our son David was nifter 7 years ago. So after he was nifter, he was 19 years old, and like after any loss, people try to find tanchumin, and I've always enjoyed letters of Gedolim, always enjoyed reading about Gedolim, and after his patira, I read a lot of letters from different Gedolim and was searching, and Rav Dessler, Rav Emilio is full of letters. Rav Hutner, Bach Yitzchak has a bunch of letters. So I guess the first, when I just started going through the basic svarim that have letters, I found lots of letters that spoke to me, that gave me a lot of chizuk. So from Rav Emilio, Rav Hutner, Rav Olba, and then as I continued, looking, searching, and finding, and asking others about letters, I found that there's the Lekach Tov, Pirkei Emunah Milchama already gathered some letters there. There's another sefer by Yid in Monroe, Hoyel Yehuda had a few letters there, and then Oyel Moshe of Shineman has a few letters there. And as I started reading more and seeing more, I thought it would be the chizuk that I was getting, I felt it would be so meaningful as time went on, if I could just put it together, make a small kuntras. And then as time went on, I said, well, it could be more than just a small kuntras. It could be maybe more of a sefer. But that, I don't think at the beginning I thought it would be a sefer. I thought it would just be some 25, 35, whatever letters. But as I said, it was just, as I got more into it and I sort of enjoyed it and got the chizuk from it, I would just ask people, Talmidei Chachamim, if they knew of any letters. And to my surprise, many were not familiar with letters. They just wasn't their thing. Certain people who just were maybe, perhaps just more well-read and more familiar with letters, they were referencing Gedolei Yisroel. There's Rav Vermelio Kaplan, he has over there in the back. And then I was looking and searching, Eitzar Chachma was helpful, more and more, and then certain things just popped up in Hashgacha, looking at a sefer here, looking at a sefer there, going to a svarim store and flipping through different svarim, and I bumped into a letter in back of a sefer, and speaking to lots of people and just looking for it during Sefer Zecharinis, different letters or biographies, somewhere in the middle, there's letters here and there. So that's where I came across a lot of them.
So as you're saying, so the idea really came about as you were reading these letters for yourself, and then eventually you decided just to put it together and publish it in Nishmas your son? Correct.
And when I put it together, and at some point I called up Shimon Shmanowitz. Someone mentioned to him, or someone mentioned to me from Lakewood, he would be the right person, a good person maybe to ask you whether he's interested. I called him up and I sent him an email, sent him a file of these letters. He was excited. He said, he was very, very excited about such a project. He thought it would be a great seller, a great chizuk. And from there we moved on. And he was the one that put out the Hebrew Vayinachim David. And very grateful to him he really did a nice job. And Baruch Hashem, very happy how it came out.
Yeah, and we can get a little bit more into that. That came out by Yonachim David, it was a few years ago, and then just recently, like I said, the English edition came out. So as you mentioned, we'll discuss some of the letters here. I think we can discuss more like the method of putting it together and the translation, all that a little after. I want to discuss some letters, but one more thing I would ask you is, so how did you really find the letters? I mean, you mentioned you found them just looking around. People told you. I mean, is that just how it was? It was just
a lot of letters. There's the chunk of letters from the basic svarim, and just we had to divide them up into categories. Rav Obel's letters, and it has a bunch. Rav Dessler, I told you, Rav Shach, the disciple. Those are certain igros svarim, and then there are the more not as common svarim. Or to find Rav Eli Weintraub has a sefer also machtav. And once I was getting to the letters, someone pointed out, Rav Eli Weintraub has a sefer of letters. Rav Zulman Kreiser doesn't have a sefer, but someone mentioned, Rav Zulman Kreiser has a letter printed in the back of in one of the svarim. In fact, one of the first letter, the Rambam, the interesting thing of that letter was, I did not know that there was such a letter of the Rambam. And my son, at the time he was maybe 9 years old, and he took a book out of the school library, Great Jewish Letters, and he was looking through. That's by Ramesha Bamberger, and he was looking through it, and he said, "Hey, there's a letter for the Rambam." So wow, I thought I saw all the letters. Like I was convinced that I saw all the letters that B'negei Tanchumen, or a good chunk of them, and this letter from the Rambam was there. I was in a spall, and he brings in a source where he got it from. Printed in Divrei Chachamim. So I went to the source. He had it in English, and I saw, wow, this is an amazing letter. So that was the Rambam letter. I'll just tell you, just as an interesting background to printing that letter. That letter, like I said, was printed originally in Sefer Divrei Chachamim in 1849. That was the first time that it was printed, it seems. More recently, there's a Sefer Igros Rambam printed by Shilach in Eretz Yisrael, who put together all the different letters on the Rambam, and this is amongst them. And he shows that this letter is very authentic. Kisviyat from Oxford, Kisviyat from different places, where he's certain that this is the Rambam. But when I was about to print the Sefer, the Hebrew, the original, I showed the Sefer to a person from Eretz Yisrael who was visiting America and who was very well versed in letters, svarim, and a lot of things. And he looked through the Sefer. He liked it very much, but he asked me, or he told me, he said, that letter of the Rambam, I would pay you not to print. I would do whatever you do not print that letter. I don't believe it's the Rambam. He was convinced that it's a ziyuf. It can happen over the years. People say it's the Rambam. It's not the Rambam. And he thinks the way it's written, the fact that the Rambam seemed to have a taina on this Rabbeinu Yefes, he was a dayan in Eretz Yisrael, Rabbeinu Yefes, the Rambam is writing to him, you haven't responded to me, and since Rabbeinu Yefes had a taina, why didn't you answer me? The Rambam said to him, well, it's been a number of years since I lost my father, my brother, and you didn't send any tanchum, people from all over sent letters, and you didn't. He said, the Rambam, you think the Rambam would write that? Chaz v'shalom, and the Rambam says, I lost money, and I lost this, and lost that. It was so hard for me. I was broken for the first year. I was tzibrochen. I was in my bed. I was dying. And for 8 years, the Rambam writes, I'm still nesavalti in the nachamti. So this person told me, he doesn't believe it. How could it be? The Rambam would never say such words. It's not the Rambam. I don't believe it. Do not print it. So I told him, I hear what he's saying. Let me discuss it with my Rebbe, Reb Tzvi Berkowitz, and I'll ask him if he tells me that no, there's such a thing here, he doesn't believe it is, or I'll accept it. So I spoke to him, and he asked me where I got it from, and he said, speak to my brother-in-law in Eretz Yisrael, Reb David Kamenetsky, that's Shmuel's son, and asked him, he's more familiar with Kisvei Yad, and so I emailed him, I called him, I spoke to him, and he was familiar with the letter. He said, let me look into it. I'll get back to you. I spoke to him soon after. And he said, what's bothering this person? He says, yes, his brother supported him. Yes, losing money is not easy. Yes, becoming sick for a year. Yes, still feeling the pain after 8 years. And then he writes, he told me, this letter gives us chizuk to be normal and feeling the pain. The Rambam was not made of plastic. That was his lashon to me. The Rambam was not made of plastic. He was a human being. So after getting that chizuk from him and that boost, I said, okay, I think that letter deserves to be in there and should be in there. And I think reading it is an amazing thing just to see. The Gedolei, the Rambam, how he writes, what he writes, every word is meduik, of course. And I try to reference a number of things in the Hebrew edition, and also in the English. I made mention, interesting, the Rambam, like at one point he writes, Lulei sarascha shashuai, like without Torah, Vidivrei Chachma. So I try to explain what the Divrei Chachma, perhaps what the Rambam means. He seems to be adding something over there. But like I said, every word is meduik, of course. And in the Hebrew, I pointed out, and a little bit less in the English. But I made mention in the English. I pointed out that the Rambam writes, he needed something. It was the Torah, it was the Divrei Chachma that gave him something to keep him alive, to keep him afloat. There's a Ramban I mentioned in the English. The Ramban points out by Yehuda, after Yehuda lost his wife and his 2 children, the pasuk says that Yehuda, Vayinochim Yehuda, Vayal Ligzes at Sinai. So what's the connection with Vayinochim Yehuda, and then he went to be Geis at Sinai? The Ramban says an amazing thing, which I have not seen anyone to really that spells on this, goes on this, the Ramban writes, the way Yehuda found Tanchuma was he had to do something just to help him deal with and help him forget about his tsaris, his daiga, and he went to be Goy's Sunday. That was his leaving his peckle behind to be able to do something that will help him. But many people, it is as you see from the letters, many Gedolim write, it's the Torah that gives them the chizuk and halavai. Many are able to, and sometimes it just to be able to divert their minds and to be able to get something else. That's what they get the chizuk. But I was that Rambam, that first letter, it was an amazing thing to see.
Yeah, it really is, and like you said, it was like Sheila published it. I mean, this letter of the Rambam, and maybe it surprises people. I mean, he says he was sick, he was lying in bed, he was depressed. I mean, he says for a while, and he says he was really bothered by this. His brother, like you say, he was very close to his brother. His brother supported him. His brother died. I mean, it's a very moving letter, and he talks about, he says he's every time he sees his brother's handwriting, he sees anything of his brother, right, he remembers the pain, and right, he brought up his brother. I mean, it's a very moving a letter. It really is, and like you said, I think David Kamenetsky put it well there. He's not made of plastic. You see this. I think when you read letters and stories of Gedolim. I did recently did a podcast with Shimon Shemanowitz, who you mentioned, on the Igra Seifrim, the letters of the Igra Seifer family, and we went through a lot of the letters, not about this, but just you see the personal letters. I've done a podcast and I've talked to listeners about Magal Toiv, the Chida's travelogue. You read something of a Gadol, you read autobiography, you read letters, you read actually what they were. I mean, it's nice to read its biographies. People read biographies of Gedolim, but when you actually read what the Gedolim wrote, you're actually reading their own words, and you're reading, they're saying who they are. This is the facts, for sure, undoubtedly. So yes, so that's one letter you have early on. The second letter, most of the letters, as you've kind of the names you mentioned before, are kind of more modern Gedolim, so to speak. But the second letter here, you have a letter from Rabbeinu Israel.
Right.
Mentioned that as well, and then you kind of we do get on later in the 19th and 20th century.
Right. The Rabbeinu Options is a classic letter. I call it classic, but it was printed originally, I think, in the Sefer called Gedolei Yisroel, and it was written in Yiddish, or I think they write it's called the jargon or some type of Yiddish, not our regular Yiddish, and it was translated more recently in the 80s in Pnei Baruch. I'm trying to remember how I got to it. I think I got to it. Well, I remember now I got to it. When I was working on this Sefer, the Tzvi Schweinreb, who's from Baltimore, I was speaking to him. I asked him, does he have any letters that he would recommend, or any letters that he knows of? And I think he mentioned this Pnei Baruch, this Ernest and Eibshit. And he always said, you look at the letter, you see an amazing thing that he writes, how he was writing to his sister-in-law, and writing to her how you have to take care of yourself, and taking care of yourself is, I think his lashon is like even Yosef saying Kaddish. He was just stressing the fact that you have to take care of yourself. It's not an easy tkufa, but take care of yourself and do whatever you need to stay well. He in this letter, he really points out a lot of different basic fundamentals in our emunah of like I said, emunah, dealing with suffering, how our Baruch is perfect, and we have to accept it. But it's just beautifully written, and there's a lot there that really, I think, gives a perspective, gives on pain, suffering, and death. So that was Rimson Eibshitz.
Yeah, I'm not. You mentioned the Yiddish. I'm not familiar with the original letter. I will say that, but it could be Yiddish and Deutsch, which is Yiddish German kind of mix. Sometimes that they did that, so it could be that's what you're referring to. Okay, so what other letters? I'll let you pick out some letters.
Right, there's a letter. There's a letter from the letter number 9. Letter from the Imre Emes. Now, this letter of the Imre Emes was printed in Likutei Yehuda, which is a Chumash Sefer. It was printed maybe other places afterwards. But this letter of the Imre Emes, he wrote it in 1945, December 1945. And the letter was to give Yidden around the world chizuk, give them after the war. Now, the letter itself is also just reading the words of the Imre Emes, just trying to imagine what things were like in 1945, how Yidden around the world must have felt just so miyuyish and so everything is for what they after what they went through and what they experienced, what they heard, what they saw. It just uplifting how he writes, nothing comes bad, everything is perfect. But interesting, he quotes Rabbeinu Maimon, which is the Rambam's father. He quotes a letter that says, I'm just reading from the English, the rope of Torah and mitzvahs connects heaven to earth, and to the degree that one holds onto the rope, so is his strength. Meaning, just telling them, hold on tight, stick to the Torah, realize everything's from Hashem, everything's perfect. But the letter itself, as I pointed out in the Akdama to this letter, I saw it printed in the Sefer Giburei Achayil, that this letter arrived in Shanghai, and they asked Reb Chatzkel, did he see the letter? Did he see the letter of the Imre Emes? Reb Chatzkel said, did I see it? Did I read it? I learned it. And Reb Chatzkel, in fact, quoted this letter in the Shmuz in Shanghai. So I don't know how often Reb Chatzkel quoted the Imre Emes, but this letter apparently was enough to him. If the Imre Emes wrote it, and it was something of chizuk to be able to help out Yidden and in this matziv during those years. I thought it was, although it was Tanchumen to a person, personally, but it was something just giving a hashkaf, giving a chizuk, giving a hadracha, how to deal with the loss that they experienced. Reb Dessler, there's a letter I bring down from Reb Dessler, letter number 11. Also, I would say this is more general Tanchumen. He wrote this letter in 1941, and he wrote it to his daughter, and his daughter and his wife were in Australia, and Reb Dessler at that point was in England. His son Nachum Zev was in America. As I write in the introduction to this letter, they were all scattered all over Dal Kanfis Haaretz, and it took a number of years, 6 years I think, until they all got back together again. They were all scattered, but the letter, just reading the letter, how he writes to his son, Reb Dessler, his letters are always just, the words are, he writes at the beginning, today I'll write you, I'll write, he's writing to his daughter, today I will write you about what our beloved Ben Zakunim Nachum Zev expressed in 2 words, alone and forsaken. And he continues, he says, just promising you, my dear one, that you will not cry throughout your reading of this letter. And he continues to give her the hashkafa that, everything HaKadosh Baruch Hu does with b'cheshbon, and the hardest of times gives the greatest opportunity of times, as you see by Kriyas Yamsuf, that even a Shub Chal Hayam saw Mashallah Yecheskel Ben Buzi, and even someone he was pointing out in such a matzah when things are so difficult, that's good for where they have that opportunity to rise to great heights. So he's giving her the chizuk that although yes, you're alone, you feel as if I'm not with you, and your brother's not with you. We're all separated, but just don't give up. You're not alone. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is always with you. I thought that was could be a very uplifting type of letter. There's a letter I quote from, or I bring down a letter from Reb Chatzkel San, in letter 18, he's writing a letter to the family of Reb Avram Eliyahu Kaplan. Reb Avram Eliyahu Kaplan was the Talmud of Slobodka, head of the Beis Medrash Rabbanim in Berlin, and it was nifter at 34. So this letter was written as Reb Chatzkel San was 1924. He's on the way up to Eretz Yisrael to establish Slobodka, to establish Chevron, Slobodka and Chevron there. And Reb Avram Eliyahu Kaplan and Reb Chatzkel San were very close friends. And in the letter, you see how he himself was so tzebrach, and so he himself writes, I'm writing you a letter, but I'm in need of comfort myself. I'm in need of comfort. I'm in need of chizuk. When you hear how, as a good friend, which he was to Reb Avram Eliyahu Kaplan, it's just because we imagine a gadol being, everything's easy, not necessarily. He was tzebrach, and it's hard, it's difficult, it's painful, and he apologizes in the letter that he felt he left in a rush. He should have been giving them more chizuk, more tanchumen. But like you pointed out, in any letter, you really see the gadol themselves speaking personally, what you hear that, you hear themselves, you hear the human side, so to say, of the Gadol. There's a letter 21, which this also I came across. Just speaking to friends, speaking to people, and someone pointed out, did you see the Ramesha, the newest Chelek Vav and Archaim Chelek Vav? There's a letter Ramesha writes, and I guess it's more a letter written to Klal Yisrael, more just to be able to have the proper hashkafa. And this letter was written in December 1976. There was a group of sheikhim traveling from New York. They were going early morning from New York to Pennsylvania to do shechita, and it was a winter day. Early morning, the car slid on ice, and the truck was coming, and 5 of the sheikhim were killed. So I added that background, so to say, to the letter, because again, did he get a little perspective of what Ramesha was addressing, and the way he writes it, and with sensitivity and with a sort of uplifting feeling you get from reading this letter, but yet at the same time being mechazek us, we believe, we know everything HaKadosh Baruch Hu does is perfect. And I would say, there are many letters that maybe perhaps have the same message, and reading all them at once, I wouldn't recommend that. But, over the course of day after day, it does sink in, and yes, you do hear it, and it does become something that gives chizuk when you, not the same message, but very similar messages. But like I said, it's something which day after day, it does give, like I said, chizuk.
And in that letter, Ramesha, I mean, there's Torah in there. He's quoting Gemaras. I mean, there's so. By the way, I would mention that these letters, there's some Torah. It's not only just Sam talk, and I would mention that as well.
Right. There's a letter. The letter that I quote, letter 22 in the English, where that's letter by Rav Mordechai Schwab, and he, this letter I found in Kuntras Igros Mamari Mordechai. I remember seeing it years ago, and when I was trying to find it, I was able to pull it out of the shelf. It was Kuntras. I think they put together maybe in more of a sefer, but originally it was printed in Kuntras Mamari Mordechai. In that letter, he writes, he quotes from his Rebbe, Reb Baruch Ber, that Reb Baruch Ber had a young nephew who was nifter, and he writes he was an outstanding Talmid Chacham, Torah, Yerushalayim, but he was 19. He writes, and then he said on the day of his patira, Reb Baruch Ber had to say shir in the yeshiva, and he said it with unusual enthusiasm, and people overheard him say, the avodah must continue, the avodah must go on, and he said, Baruch Ber repeated it over and over, that a person, the avodah has to go on. I think hearing that you have to move on, you have to continue. Yes, at the moment it's painful and difficult, and you can't imagine how could life go on, but just when he writes that the avodah must go on, the avodah must, we as Yidden, we know that yes, it's painful, yes, it's hard. Right now, it's impossible to see how life will return to what it was. The avodah must go on. We know we have to move on, we have to go on, we have to continue being Ehrlich and doing whatever we can to for us, for ourselves, for our family, and that's something which I thought was meaningful. Rav Wolbe, I have a bunch of letters from Rav Wolbe, and in one letter he writes, he gives chizuk saying he's writing to another Talmid Chacham, just realize you're not alone. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is there with you. That itself, I think, just a person knowing. Never is there a moment that a person could feel like this is something which only I'm contending with. Yes, it's true, it's painful, but everything is done with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, knowing how, when, why. That, like I said, that's something which gave me chizuk. Rebellia Weintraub in a letter also, he writes, it's something beyond our beyond our comprehension. So these are something which, like I said, gives us chizuk. Interesting, there's a letter from Rabbi Zundel Kreiser where he writes, he writes to a family who seemed to be being misabel yoisumidai, and he tells them there's halachas, there's a way to do it. Don't overdo it. So some people think that when you machmer avilas, no need to be machmer avilas. There's halachas, how much and how, and being crying too much and being misabel too much is not the way to go. So again, but that's I thought that was good to hear. In the section on the section just the letters to children on the passing of their parents, passing of parents. So there's the first that I have from Rabbi Yerucham. That letter is printed in Das Chacham Musar. And also, it's a very Ravolba references this letter many times in his Svar, in his Sefer, Nali Shor, and also in his letters. And he writes that the message which is very basic hashkafa of ours, which is that in this case it was a father. He said, your father did not die or has not died. So the message being that although yes, physically he's not here, but he is here. His life goes on, and he writes in a beautiful way, quoting Chazal, and bringing out the message that your relative, although they may not be here physically, they are here just as much as your friend is next door. They're here, just they change location from. He writes the same as, like I said, basically as if they're going from one city to another city. They went from this world to the next world, but they're in God's in here. So I think that's a very basic hashkaf. I noticed also that I got from the Reb Tzvi Pesach Frank in a number of there's a biography on Reb Tzvi Pesach. I noticed that I was able to get some letters from their small excerpts of letters, and you see from the Reb Tzvi Pesach writes how he, like I said, he himself writes how hard it was after his father was nifter, and in other letters he writes how after his daughters, he had two daughters that were nifter, and they were already older. They weren't. They were married, and apparently they had families. He writes how he knows what it was, what it meant, what it is to experience what a very hard such a loss. I'll just going through a number of letters. The Pnei Menachem himself lost two children. And he writes that in the Pnei Menachem is the words. You see how he's writing how I think he had one child that was born with an illness and was nifter. Maybe it was a few years later, and then he had a son who was married and Nebuch was hit by I think it was a bus and tragically was killed. And he writes. He's writing tanchum to parents who experienced the loss. And when a person gets the chizik from someone who they themselves went through it, it's a whole different level. I pointed out, I think, when or by the Pnei Menachem, I remember reading. I think it was in the biography. They point out that one of his chumash svarim, or one of the after his son was nifter, it was very hard for him to say his regular shir. He was not maybe I think it was Rashiva of Ger. And his regular shir klali or Ian shir was very hard for him to be able to focus, so to say, on to be able to give that. And then he was giving chumash shir with an Ian dika chumash shir, and that I don't know for how long that went on. And eventually they put him to a safer form. But he said that's what he was at that it was just too much for him to be able to keep his mind in the regular Ian shir, and he gave that the chumash shir that was something that he was able to give him, that gave him the chizik, and that he was able to do. Just point out that there's a letter which many perhaps have heard of in some way. There's a letter from the English one. It's in the passing of a spouse. There's a letter from Reb Kiva Eger, 67, where apparently shortly after Reb Kiva Eger's wife was nifter, two of his friends wanted to read a shidduch. It was within the shleishim, and in this letter, he writes. This letter was written in 1796. He writes in a very bakavadik way, of course. how hard it is for him, and how his wife and him were so close. And he writes, they would be up until Al Chatzos Alayla B'Vikuchim of Yerushalayim. But he points out in this letter, which I found was a chizuk. Again, he writes, I can't even, my davening and my learning, it's so difficult for me to be able to focus on my davening and to be able to focus on my learning. I think hearing that from Rabbi Veger, a person gets the chizuk that he's a human being. If he has a hard time focusing and davening and learning after a loss, Rabbi Veger had the same challenge. Yet he moved on, and yes, he became Rabbi Veger, and a long life after. And his first wife was Nifter, but something that he had to contend with, something that was a challenge, and he lived with it, and that's something which I think when you read that and you see that, that's something which gives a chizuk.
Yeah, that letter, he really, he really, like you said, he really goes through it, and he actually went and read the English also. I have the Hebrew and the English in front of me. The English is, do you consider me tough and heartless that I should run to remarry during my period of mourning? And he talks about his wife. I have the English in front of me, so I'll read it now. I close the Hebrew. Shall I forget the beloved of my youth, my pure dove, with whom Hashem favored me? I think it's Yanasi, Samasi, right? He's quoting the Psukim, and he's saying, right. Exactly, how can I go and think about that?
Right. There's all, in the section on losses of children, letters of consolation to parents, rather, I have a number of letters there, a bunch of letters. This is the first that I have from the Nitziv, and that letter was printed in Nishmas Chaim, which is Kisri from Reb Chaim Berlin. So the letter was written to Reb Chaim Berlin after Reb Chaim, I write in the Akdama, that after the Nitziv writes to send upon the passing two of Reb Chaim's daughters. After Reb Chaim Berlin had two daughters that were nifter. And again, he's giving over the hashkafa, that everything is latayv. But I guess not only the letter, not only the words, but just knowing that Reb Chaim Berlin lost two daughters, I think that itself, there's no way I feel like I put a list of Gedolim who have lost children, and many times after going through a loss, a person questions, I must be doing something bad, I must be doing something wrong, I'm being punished, I'm terrible, and that's not the hashkafa. That's not. I pointed out in later on in the sefer, in one of the bottom in the sefer, where you see that's not how we deal with it. And the fact that I could go through a list of Gedolim, the Chayot, the Chavetz Chaim, Reb Chaim Berlin, Rabbi Yisrael Chaim Zonkel, Rabbi Elvin, Rabbi Yashav, Rabbi Moshe, the Satmar Rebbe, Risky Bezach Frank, Pnei Menachem, Rav Shach, Rav Michal Yudah, Reb Chaim Oizer, Risky Rav, all these lost children, and just to say, Baruch who's taking revenge on us, that's not the hashkafa. In fact, I pointed out, I read in one of the letters on the bottom, I wrote that someone approached someone approached the discipler after his child was nifter, and he asked him, what should I be mechazik? And the discipler basically told him that the Chazon Ish said, he said the Chazal say Yifashish from Aisav, Yifashish from Aisav. The Chazon Ish said, which I think if I would have said it, people would have said, how can you say such a thing? Chazal said, the Chazon Ish said that Yifashish from Aisav, when we can't nowadays say it's this particular, this is the reason. We don't, that hashgacha we don't have nowadays to be able to identify what it is. And he said, if you just try that, if a person would do that, he would just go crazy. This, again, and then I pointed out, Rav Shach, right? It's a person, has a particular thing that he feels that, they keep him chazik in general, tired, but to start zochim, trying to find it's this, you can't live that way. And from other Gedolei Yisroel would say the same thing. Just continue, move on, be an erlich, daven and learn, do chesed, do all the way you have to do. And you can't get down and start trying to cheshbonize, why this, why me, why this time? That's beyond us. I think we will live much better as erlich and just accepting the fact that is what Baruch Hu wanted itself will give us much more way to live as Avdei Hashem. I point in the next letter, 87, the Chofetz Chaim lost a son, and he himself mentions that in this letter to his friend. His son had his friend had a son in Radin, and the Chofetz Chaim, and the child was Nifter. And the Chofetz Chaim writes how he himself went through it with his son Avram. And in fact, I point out that his son, the Chofetz Chaim, writes great shvachim about his son. He quotes in the Beralach in the Chashavos, and in Likutei Halachos and Nakdama, he writes how his son was very involved in the writing of Likutei Halachos, and so he held that his son was from going to be someone great. He was a tremendous person. Yet he was nifter young. The disciple points out in the letter also. He writes out. I think he writes that how the Gedolei, the Shach and the Ramah were nifter very young. And I point out on the bottom from the Shem Gedolei, from the Chidah, I think at what age? I think age 40 or age 42. These Gedolei were nifter at a very young age, and he was just pointing out that I believe that the disciple was writing that it. We found even by our great Gedolim, apparently I don't remember the exact lashon enough to find it, but he may say that it seems that they have accomplished what they had to accomplish, and they're nifter at that time. But just knowing that from the Gedolei Yisroel experienced personally these losses, and amongst them you even see the certain Gedolim themselves that certain were nifter very young, and I think that it helps to get a perspective on dealing with tragedy, dealing with loss. Later, there's another letter which maybe people are as familiar. There's the letter Rabbi Yochanan writes to the Alter of Sabatka. The Alter of Sabatka had a son. He had a son, Ramesha. Was I point out in the English? I think the Ramesha was Ramesha Finkel. The Alter's son was known as he was like the up and coming Gadol. When Reb Aaron met, Reb Aaron. When Reb Aaron, I think I read in the beginning of here that Ramesha Finkel went with Reb Aaron to Remeir Simcha. They visited the Or Sameach, and Or Sameach, when he met them, I guess he spoke to them the learning. After they left, Remeir Simcha said to his family that the Reb Aaron was going to be the future of the Kiveger of the Dar. And Ramesha Finkel would be the K'tzais of the generation. But just imagine the Aved, the loss that the Alter Sabbat had to experience after his son Ramesha was nifter. I think it was on Sukkot, Cholamayit, and it was a tremendous loss. But when you see these different Gedolim after what they went through, what they experienced, I think it gives helps shape a perspective of in hearing what they said and what they wrote and how they dealt with it. And Rabbi Yochanan gives chizuk to the Alter of Sabbath. Just reading their words is something which I got lots of chizuk from.
Yeah, I want to, there's a lot of letters, and we can mention some others, but there's lots of 119 letters here. So you mentioned we're referencing the English and the numbers. First of all, I'll mention that you changed the numbering between the English and the Hebrew. It's a little different. Also, something nice about the English is that in the beginning of each letter, there's a picture of the Gadol, and there's, you said the years when they live, which is nice, so people can get some sort of context. And then you write, in small, there's an explanation of when the letter was. And then the Hebrew has it also. But a lot of times in the English, there's also, like, you mentioned a couple of times, there's more of like a background for the letter. Like I said, the Hebrew has also, but I think the English has a little more. Is that accurate? Like, what changed between the English edition and the Hebrew edition?
I did feel in the English when I felt that when I was going through all the letters and being masada them, I noticed that I did not accurately put I felt to add the dates when they lived and when they died would, like you said, would add a perspective to the Gadol was and when they lived, and I wanted to put it in chronological order of when they died, when they're nifter. So I reorganized the four sections of the Sefer remained the same, but in each section the letters, the numbering is a little different. It's the same 119 letters in order of that, but some letters were switched around in order to keep it in the chronological order. So if you take the Hebrew Sefer and match it up, you're not sure what he means in letter 105, you just might have to go two letters before, two letters after, just to find it, which shouldn't be too difficult it should be pretty simple to identify the letter. By the heading, usually more or less the same most of the time. But like you say, the pictures I added, I felt the English-speaking public would appreciate a picture. Not saying the Hebrew maybe we would have added to it, but I guess I wanted more of a safer surah, although the cover has a nice picture, different than a regular typical safer. But I think the picture definitely add a lot to it. And the dates, like I said, I think the average English reader may not be as familiar or may not know. Okay, when did Rav Nachum Bertzovitz live? When did Tzvi Pesach live? You get a certain the dates were helpful, and also I think the background of the letter I think just helped. When Rav Nachum Bertzovitz is writing a letter to Rav Shmuel Birnbaum after Rav Shmuel lost his son, tragically killed. So you get you feel even the letter contains some basic fundamentals, yesodis, but after you hear that, wait, Reb Shmuel Birnbaum lost a son who was killed. Oh, okay, let me read this. You could connect to it in a certain way, and you could appreciate what Reb Nachum is trying to convey to. In this case, it was Reb Shmuel Birnbaum.
Sorry, I want to ask. So, what kind of feedback did you get on the Hebrew that you decided to have the English edition?
Yeah, I remember clearly that. One day, I think it was during lunch in school, all of a sudden I get a buzz soon after the Hebrew Sefer came out. And there was, I think maybe the first phone call I got about the Sefer, I was just so excited that there was a Yid in Borough Park, I think a grandson for the Baba Rebbe got the Sefer, and he was just very, excited about the Sefer, thanking for the Sefer, and he sent me some of his letters. Even though he himself, I don't think, experienced loss. But soon after that, there was a woman in Eretz Yisrael who called me up, and I always feel that probably many people don't call up, which I'm assuming they're hearing it because they just don't bother calling, and I myself probably not from those people who are calling other people after I read their Savior, but the fact that someone called me meant a lot. So a woman called me up. She herself lost a son after her son was, I think, 18, 19 years old. And she with the words she used, she told me, he gave me such chizuk, but it did not only help me deal with what I'm going through, right now after the loss of her child, it's really giving me chizuk in other areas in her life. And apparently she had a lot of other tsaris or nisyanis that she had to contend with, and she got just tremendous chizuk going through the Sefer. There's another woman, again, these people I never met, I don't know who they are, but the woman called me up and she told me it was right after Corona, Tkufa, and she said she had a son, Chashva Talmud Chacham. This woman was an older woman, but apparently very. She went through. She said she stayed up throughout the night going through the Sefer, and she was just thanking me, crying, thanking me for what I did for her. There was another Yid, which I speak to him every so often, at least once a year, twice, 3 times a year. I call him just to say hello. This person from Borough Park, he had a son in the yeshiva there, and is coming home on bike in Abach. He was killed a number of years ago. And soon after the Sefer came out, the tragedy took place a little while, not much before the Sefer came out. The Sefer came out, he got a hold of the Sefer, he read this, he called me up and he said, if the Sefer came out just for me, I'm telling you it was Kedai. He was just thanking me, and he said, I'm asking you one thing. Please, can you just write it in English for my wife? That was his bakasha. And I related to that because my wife felt the same way. So that was really a push to try to be able to make it more accessible, even to the English-speaking public. And I would say even the people who are versed in reading of the Sefer, people have come over to me in English and say, it just talks to them more. It's easier for them just to, they don't have to be as focused perhaps, and they just read it. It gets easier for them. There's another person that wrote me a letter. They said, they got the Sefer, they saw the Sefer advertised in the Hebrew Sefer, and they got it. And a number of months later, Nebuch, this person's father, tragically was suddenly nefter, a heart attack. So the person wrote a letter to me saying they saw the Sefer, they got it. This person in particular likes Gedolei letters and likes the way they write and enjoys studying with the lashonis, etc. But he said the words he used to me was, it was a life preserver. I'm telling you, this safe was a life preserver. So knowing that I'm making impacting people and giving somewhat of it's not me, it's really just being malakit and taking from others and putting it together in a tzura that's presentable and making it in a way that hopefully the people will be able to be nasala from, I think is mechuzik from, is something that I feel good that I'm able to pass on that chizik that I got.
Did you do the translation work? And what, I mean, it sounds like you did the background,
Right,
like the footnotes.
right. So the translation, the translation itself, there are a number of, like I mentioned before, there are a number of publications that have a number of letters printed with these letters translated. Lekach Tov was translated into English. Lekach Tov on Amuna Menachem was translated by Reb Nachman Zatzal. And there are a number of letters there. So I got permission. I used the translation from that, but I tweaked certain things. I wanted it in a certain way to be able to make it flow the way I thought it was much more accurate, whatever it might have been. So that was from one sefer. But most of the letters that had to be were translated. I had two people translated that were. One person I knew and another person knew another person, and they were just very, very well, I guess I would say, the goal really, I would say the goal of the translation was not that it should be a literal translation, but at the same time be able to be as accurate and it can be conveyed the message and the ruach of the letter. So, and that was our hope. And I do think that someone just came over to me, I just spoke to someone and said, I'm 3/4 through your safe, and it just reads very easily. It just reads easily, and I think that really was the goal, to be able to make it easily read, at the same time keeping that the authenticity of the letter. So the people I have to be one of the people who translated it was my sister-in-law, one of my sister-in-laws who were just really very familiar, very good at translation. After she worked on it, she would hand it back to me and email it to me, and I would work on it to be able to see it, compare it to the Hebrew, and see how it matches up, how it really is it took time because it was a work in changes and back and forth. Is it really as he meant? Is this are they using it in this way? Is it not? So that was really the idea of the translation. And really at the beginning, when I went to I spoke to Israel Bookshop, who is a cousin of mine. Ramesh Kaufman is a cousin, my wife's first cousin. So when I presented him with the idea, he liked the idea of having it translated. But I guess he asked me, do I have someone to translate? And I told him I do, but he wanted to see their work before he was willing to translate, before he's willing to print it. So I sent him a few letters that was translated. We got translated, and he was happy with it. And the translation, like I said, the bulk of it was what we got translated, and I worked on it and compared it and discussed it and shoot it over. I remember someone come over to me saying, "Why is the thing so long to put out the saver? Just put it out." But I felt I wanted it to be done right. I would rather wait 3 extra months or 6 extra months or 8 extra months just to be able to make it done right. So my feeling is, I'm not saying it's perfect. I know certain flaws, but I would say I'm happy with the finished product. I'm happy with how it came out, and the translation I'm happy with. And it took time.
So what would you say, to a listener here, or to someone looking to purchase a safer? What can they gain from the safer? Of course, as you mentioned, there's those sections, and people, someone, Leilena lost a parent, a spouse, a child. But and then there's the general letters. But what can someone gain from it? Either someone in that matziv, or just someone that didn't chas v'shalom lose someone. What can they take out of
I think as growing people, as Erlachim, which we are, we I think there's some basic building blocks which as Yid we need to have, and I think knowing that there's something as death, and knowing how to deal with it, and knowing how to deal with. And seeing how the Gedolim themselves dealt with it, seeing how they themselves dealt with personal losses, give a tremendous infusion of emunah. And reading the letters really boost our emunah, I wouldn't just say just klolistic, but really seeing in life, seeing firsthand how they deal with life challenges and how they dealt with talking to others who are dealing with the real life challenges. Many times we learn Svarim, talking about Amunah, talking about staying strong. But now, when facing the challenge, facing after a loss, which could be so devastating, so difficult, and people might have questions and they're not understanding, and seeing how they themselves are giving over the hashkafa in a delicate, sensitive, but strong way to be able to give that chizuk. I find personally that's something which a person getting the safe is not just we're just reading stories, or not just reading about them suffering, or how they suffer, but really hearing from them, very, like I said, getting a strong infusion of emunah. And also, I think, reading some letters, I think the Siva Shalom pointed out in some of his letters, that there's certain times where we can be down on ourselves, and certain times we just have to be very optimistic and hopeful. And he says many times in his letters, which during the times when things are tough and difficult, it's not the time to start trying to figure out why things are happening, and why is Hashem punishing, so to say, quote unquote punishing. Or now's the time to be able to accept and realize, be uplifted in a certain way as best as we can, and trying to realize that sort of Pa'ala. In fact, I read in the beginning, I'll just point it out because I think it was gave me a lot of chizuk. In the preface of the Sefer, I start off with the words Hatzur Tom and Pa'ala Kichod Rachav Mishpat. So I quote the Ksava Kabbalah that brings that up. Pshat Sur is from the words Tzrurois B'Sim Lois. When they even left Mitzrayim, they wrapped up their belongings. Tzrurois, Lashon tying, knotting together. So he said a pshat. He says a pshat. Sur Tom Pa'ala Akash Baruch Hu is the tzur. He's the one that knots together everything, the bria, everything from beginning to end. When we're faced with challenges, just knowing that tzur Tom and Pa'ala Akash Baruch Hu is the tzur. He's the one that ties everything in history from beginning to end. Knowing that we don't have any inkling of why things are happening, how they're happening, why it has to be this way. Just knowing that, I think, gives a very, very strong message and perspective on things. That point out from Rav Dessler, he gives a mashal about a map. That you have a map that's covered, and it's hard to locate, to find anything. You uncover part of the map, and you'll be able to see, this road leads here, leads there, and everything is intertwined, everything's connected, and you see how when it's covered, you can't see anything, you can't understand. You uncover one part, you have no idea how you're going to get to the other city, to the other country, and that's really life. And that message, I think, is throughout the Sefer. At Sotam Pa'ala, now we don't have a perspective, we don't have an understanding why things are happening. Realize everything is latayv, although we may not understand it. And really, Akash Baruch Hu is the master planner, and the timing of everything, and where it happened and why it happened. It's all part of Akash Baruch Hu's perfect plan. But knowing that and hearing that over and over in different ways, I would say, and I think it's of course it's a book, it's a sefer, voice of consolation for those who have dealt with or dealing with a loss, but it really gives a perspective, and it really gives a chizuk, a boost of emunah, a boost of injection of real life emunah.
Okay. Do you have? I just want to ask you about you working on anything else? Putting anything else together? This is it.
It's a good question. Someone did ask me that same question. A few people have asked me. I was thinking of maybe, which I'm not even sure myself, whether I should start going from voices of consolation to voices of simcha. Do malachah letters for Nesuin, Luz of Chasana. That's something that I'm thinking about. I'm not sure whether I'll go that way or not, but I would like to be able to continue doing something. To be able to continue in Tanchumen. I'm not sure. Someone suggested, a friend of mine, maybe it's time to get out of Tanchum and get into something else. You don't want to live a life of Nechama. At the same time, there's so much there to be able to give chizuk to others. When I myself or others have experienced it, that's really where the biggest chizuk comes, when you can say, oh, you got it. You've been there. You really know what it means. I'm not saying we have all the answers. I'm not saying we know everyone's different. And you see from the letters, and not every letter is the same. Everyone writes in a different way. A letter that one person, Rav Dessa, may talk to you, and another someone else in the Nesiv Shalom talks to you. Another person could be where Rav Shachar or what Moshe Mordechai Epstein wrote. It is, and I would say, reading the letters not all at one chunk, because someone's telling me recently he has the letter by his night table. Every night he reads one. And, I think that's probably the healthiest way to maximize the benefit of such a sefer, because you hear it over the course of time, it seeps in. And really, I think what a person could gain from it is really a key to living life of emunah, living life in an uplifting way.
Okay, I'll link to the Hebrew and English both, so if listeners are interested in either one. And the podcast, the Sefer, should be L'il Nishmas, your son David, and hopefully people, like you say, will take chizuk and nechama out of listening to this and reading the Sfarim. And thank you, R Doniel, for joining me.
Thank you. Appreciate it.